Yes, so I'll share that in a bit. So good morning. My name's Earl Crane, so appreciate you both. You jumping the gun a little bit, but it'll make sense in a moment. Welcome to Austin. I live locally, so it was only about a 30-minute drive here. So for all of you from up north, you're welcome for the warmer weather. We're above zero. And now go home because we have terrible traffic in Austin, and that's pretty much part of the Austin side of it is come here, enjoy our music, enjoy our barbecue. Don't move here. So don't do like what I did, right? But my wife's a native, so that's how I was able to get in here. They let me stay. So as Sunil mentioned, I'm going to be giving away $100 in value on this. And I was going to save it for a little bit later, but this is a teaching tool that we use. I'm an adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon. I've been teaching there for about 17 years, and the past 5, I think, has been in their executive CISO program. I believe we have a couple alumni here of the program, certainly alumni of some of the other classes. Thank you, Rich. Of some of the other classes that we've had there. This past quarter was the first time that we introduced this teaching tool at Carnegie Mellon. And these things are not cheap. If you've ever made a custom card deck before, these are about $30 a pop, certainly when you're buying them not in bulk like I am or us in our little group. So, so what I have here for volunteers, you don't need to volunteer yet, but you'll see partway through, so think about it, pay attention. To come up here and help me play a game where we're going to be building loss scenarios using this card deck, and it is a great drinking game also. So we've got that one on the line. That's how I get my $100. As you saw, I also put that the link to my slides up on Slack and tagged it with the $100 there. Who knows? We might be able to get money on the line later on as well. So hold on a second. It's getting warm up here. Okay, so I mentioned to Sunil this might go a little bit longer depending on audience interaction. I've had my 2 cups of coffee today, but I realize it's still early. So as soon as my slides get up here, I want to be able to share some of this, and I guess I need to do the hand advancer here. Okay. So what I want to talk to you about today is an excerpt from the 5-hour class that we do at Carnegie Mellon, which is on communicating the cybersecurity challenge. The class I teach now is called Advanced Cyber Risk Management. Specifically, this is a component on how we can figure out and how we can communicate some of the challenges we deal with day in and day out from a risk perspective to people that don't care or that don't understand or that don't have the context. Any of us have a problem with getting people to understand that? I know, I see a couple hands up here. So briefly on myself, I'll be around here all day, like I said, local, so can pass along barbecue recommendations as well. Consultant right now, and I'm also the co-founder at Emergent. Was the CEO, and now we have a new CEO in place for a digital risk management solution provider. Means we have a tool. But as I mentioned, also teaching at Carnegie Mellon, spent some time in the government at Homeland Security in the White House, and really my shtick has always been executive cyber risk management, so focusing on enterprise cyber risk. So what I want to share with you today is just 3 main concepts. How we can figure out to change your position, the way that you're engaging with your audience. That might be with executives, that might be with business partners, that might be with your peers, but thinking a little bit about where you put yourself as a cybersecurity leader, as a security leader, because we've got some CSOs here as well, to figure out how to position your conversation. And then want you to change your mindset. Some of you might have seen some of these concepts already, particularly if you're in banking. What keeps surprising me is how many people have not seen some of the thought leadership in banking that's been making it out slowly into the rest of the cybersecurity community. And lastly, changing our conversation, where we're going to talk about an easier, non-technical way to have a cyber risk conversation using a card deck. So let's start with changing the position. This isn't bunch ball soccer. My old boss at Homeland Security, who was the first CISO at Homeland Security, used to always comment when we were standing up the department that it was like playing bunch ball soccer, trying to get our arms around cybersecurity. And then it was the middle of taking Cert CC, transitioning over to Cert US, and just getting our arms around an enterprise CIO capability. But the challenge was, until you had clear lanes, everyone was chasing cybersecurity challenges, and this is in 2004, 2005, like kids playing soccer. Anyone have kids? Let's start there. Me too. I've got 3 of them, which is why I'm so glad I'm here. Anyone have kids that ever played soccer or even watched a kid's soccer game? So, you know, they just chase the ball. Getting them to stay in their positions is the hardest thing. And so that's one of the things to talk about here is let's change, define some lanes and start making so this isn't bunch ball soccer, but we're actually going to start defining where do you fit, where does your executive leadership fit, and how we can build some of those out. So when you look at career progression of cybersecurity professionals going down the executive track, many people start, not everyone, right? Nobody's ever cut from the same mold, but many people start in some kind of a technical role. Now that could be a policy technical role, that could be an operational technical role, but they're a SME, they're a specialist in some capability where they're possibly doing operations, operations, and some kind of a manager. They usually get to a manager position over a small team, and that's where you're dealing with blocking and tackling, incident response, and you get a good understanding of tools. You get better and better at your job, and your capability increases, and eventually you become a director of security, director of incident response, and you're able to get that much better at understanding what incidents are likely coming down the road. But you're able to start, you put together reporting modules, and you're able to start understanding that these are the different types of incidents, these are the types of issues that I've seen, and it starts to become pattern recognition. And that's where you get better at knowing what to expect next because you have pattern recognition. And that's where you start to increase in responsibility. You start hitting the tactical elements. You become a tactical CISO at that point. Moving from the security director, now people are asking you, well, what does this mean? What is the business impact to it? Give me some executive level reports because I want to understand the risk and the challenge that I'm actually dealing with here. That's where our tool justification, we start owning a budget, doing budget justification fits into that space. And the last place where certainly I try to get my students to is as a strategic CISO. Now we're talking impact to the business. We're talking about here are the bad things that could happen if we don't take action, if we don't invest in these people, processes, technologies, and these various capabilities. And that's where we start talking to providing context around the tools. Now the usual way that we progress through our careers is like this. And you can kind of already start to see where I want us to get to, where I think a lot of us want to get to. Well, I'll take that back for a minute, where people that want to be at the strategic level want to get to. Let's figure out how do we shortcut that and go in that way. So I want to take a brief poll and see how much of this resonates with you. How many of you feel like you're at the cyber ops management, you're blocking and tackling? I figure, what's that? Yeah, the exact other room. Thank you. Other room. Exactly. Other room, guys. No, this is not. Take that the right way, right? So that's a critical capability and function, right? But a lot of people over here started there and realized they wanted to be, less hands-on keyboard and more focus on business impact. How many people feel like they're at the security director level right now? Got a couple there. How many are the tactical CISO level? Few of you. And how many of you feel like you're hitting or at least trying to hit at the strategic level? A couple of hands there. A few more. A good number of hands there. That's why we're on the philosophy track. How many of you felt like you followed some element of this career progression as you go through there? A decent number. Okay, yeah, I saw some more hands pop up there. So the idea is, how do we get from here to there? That's where we're changing the conversation. So this is the piece that comes out from the banking side that's surprising, how much it hasn't yet made it to the rest of the side. It's called dealing with the 3 lines of defense. How many of you have not heard of the 3 lines of defense? I see a couple hands there. How many of you have heard of 3 lines of defense? We got about a little bit more than half the room there. So I'm going to just put both of those out because I keep turning around. So we've got our first line, and that's where the traditional CISO role usually sat, particularly when we were doing a security director role, when we're as a tactical CISO. We're sitting at the first line. We're putting out fires. We're working with the business units. And the key thing when you start splitting this out is the business unit owners own the risk. You don't want to be owning the cyber risk as a second-line CISO, because now you're owning risk that you can't directly take control of. The second-line function is developing the policies, procedures, mitigation, looking at the question, are we taking more risk than we should? That's what's happening over at the second line, looking at what are the risk management frameworks that we need to do? What are some of the models that we can start to incorporate to ask the question, are we covering the risks we need to at the first line? And the way this tends to break out is sometimes you'll have a second-line CISO and a first-line CISO. You might have a CSO at the second line and a CISO that's still at the first line. The titles don't really matter, but the fact is you get a split where some people are operating, dealing at that first line, managing it, doesn't mean that they're reporting into the people at the second line. The second line has a whole new function of looking at this from a risk management perspective. And then the third line is always audit. They haven't really changed around. You need that independent audit function. But what happens is when you look at the way a breach might take place, an incident pops up, there's an oops. Sometimes it's just because something got missed. Usually it's a collection of things, but if you don't have these multiple lines built out, there's just something got missed, and now this breach came up, and that meant that you had a single point of failure. Now you have 3 separate lines, and you would have to have failure on all 3 of those lines. The tactical business elements, the risk oversight function, and the independent audit governance function all have to be missing something for you to not have the right risk management function in place. So now there's not a single point of failure and single point of ownership. It has to be systemic across the organization. Second thing I want to talk about is changing your mindset. So now we've done our lines. We're trying to get away from bunch ball soccer. We've got 3 different lines of defense. Now we want to talk about changing the mindset around what is at risk. What are you willing to lose? What are you willing to gain? So when we're stuck back in the first line function, we're playing whack-a-mole, right? And we've all heard the whack-a-mole function. It's frustrating. I'm always putting out fires. It's the next thing that pops up. Let's shift that conversation so that now risk management, particularly at the second line, becomes a game of what-ifs. Anyone a fan of Game of Thrones here? Yes, yes. Looking forward to season 8, April. So a quote I want to share with you. Fight every battle everywhere, always in your mind. Every possible series of events is happening all at once. Live that way and nothing will surprise you. Everything that has happened will be something that you've seen before. Think about that from a risk manager, from a security perspective. You've thought through every possible loss consequence and at least have some mitigating action in place. Anyone know where this quote's from? This is Littlefinger. This is Littlefinger in his scheming, in his planning, in his insight, that he went out and was telling Arya every possible series of events. It's always happening at once. Sometimes that feels like our job. But if you live like that, don't let anything surprise you. And so what could possibly go wrong with that? Well, any of you remember this from the last episode, second to last episode of last season? He didn't see this one coming. Of all the scenarios he's lecturing about and talking about, you should see all these scenarios. He didn't see this one happening, especially when he did that himself back in the first season when he himself cut the throat and betrayed. Now, here's the issue. I don't think that's really him. This is my prediction when we're coming in, season 8, starting up soon. I think that we're going to find out that Littlefinger did run through all the scenarios, did see this coming, and we're going to find out that that wasn't really him. It was just the man with 1,000 faces. And we're going to find him come back. So let's see if that one happens and see if he really did play the card game and understand all the different scenarios and what could happen there. So here's how Littlefinger thinks about risk. Here's how we should think about risk. We start at the top and we define a risk appetite. How many of you have heard of a risk appetite before? Good, good, good. So that's awesome. We're in the philosophy track over on the other side. I don't know how much they've figured out. Risk appetite, it's how much risk you're willing to take. Right? When you're having that conversation with your executive, with your board of directors, with your even your COO, your CEO, and they say, well, I want to make sure that doesn't happen. And you say, ever? They go, yeah, ever. We say, okay, well, here's how much that's going to cost. Well, we can't spend that much. Goes, well, how big of a loss are you willing to take? Because something's going to happen under the budget you've given me. How big of a loss are you willing to take? Well, I don't want to take any. Well, then my budget just went asymptotic. You have to have a conversation about how much risk we're willing to take. So that's at the top part, the top part of it. Where are we relative to our appetite? And are we within our comfort zone? Are we operating underneath our risk appetite threshold? The way we answer that at the bottom end is we need to have key risk indicators. So we hopefully already have KPIs and KRIs for our current cyber performance, for our current cybersecurity program. And if we're even better, we've put those in other business units' performance plans so that they're part of the team. But that's part of the conversation I provided the 5-hour lecture here. But for just us, think about the KRIs that you have in your organization and ask, are they useful in informing your risk appetite? And you can do that by just asking one question. Should I be nervous about this? How many days past a certain threshold am I comfortable with a certain number of high-risk patches not being applied? And on what systems? What's the comfort level? What's the threshold I have between where we are today and how far out we could push it? That's just asking, should I be nervous? Should I be nervous about this percentage of domain admins on my environment? Should I be nervous about this number of laptops that are unencrypted, or this number of laptops or mobile devices that are lost? And if the answer is 0, you now know your threshold. You know what you need to be focusing on to spend it. And the reality is, if it's 0 anywhere, you need to rethink some of the risk assumptions that you're making and use that as part of your conversation. And the way that we do that is through scenarios. We have to paint a picture for our audience, for our executives, for the business units, of if you don't do these things, if you don't listen to me as a security executive, these are the bad things that could happen to us. And humans are so bad at imagining what hasn't happened. They just look at what was on the front page and say, well, I don't want that to happen to me. They say, okay, well, that probably won't, but variants of it could. And whatever happens to you will happen uniquely to you, for your environment. And so we have to build these scenarios, these tabletop assessments, build a picture as a risk executive of what incidents might happen and how that could hurt us and our unique business construct. And what we do is we have to put all that together and ask, is that going to push us past our risk appetite? Will these scenarios, driven by key risk indicators of what makes us nervous, drive us past an impact, we're talking dollars, a business level impact that's more than I'm willing to handle? That's the totality of the risk conversation I want you to be having with your business units, with your CFO, with your CEO when you're talking your budget justification, or if you're just describing the value of a particular policy you want to push or a tool that you want to deploy. Think about always how we can put it back into business impact language. So let's change that language. Let's have this conversation. Too frequently when we're doing our executive reporting, our board reporting, we say, well, we're yellow, right? There is a case a while back, a fellow who we worked with, who came from the financial sector, and you probably heard this story, Sunil, that during the Greek sovereign debt crisis, they were also doing cybersecurity reporting within their banking organization. And the loan officer came, or the I don't know exactly what he was called, the fellow that was in charge of risk for dealing with debt and their exposure to debt, came and said, well, if this particular thing happens, this is how exposed we are, and we're at a risk of losing X millions or billions of dollars. And they said, okay, well, thank you. I understand that now. We know what our positions are and how we need to deal with the Greek sovereign debt crisis. And then my colleague came up and said, well, the risk of a cyber attack from China is yellow. Could happen. Probably will happen. Here's how well we're defended against it, but our risk is at yellow. And the issue is, when you look at the contrast of a quantitative approach versus, our cyber's yellow, realize we need a better way to have a conversation. And so let's have that conversation by playing a game. So here's the point where I need 3 volunteers. Oh, I saw that hand. Come on up here. 2. Sunil, you want to? Okay. Come on up, Sunil. And ma'am, come on up. I saw your hand pop up first. Awesome. So, what we're gonna do? Are you passing off to someone else? Here we go. Pass the buck. Here's the deal. Once you guys have this, you can play this as well too. So. Wait, if you play, you get the cards. This is the $100. This is $100 giveaway right here. So now I've got my deck here, because it has my name on it. So put your name on it. The people will swipe these. So I have my deck here, and I'll put up a link where you can order them afterwards as well. But you guys are already here, signed up, so you've got your deck for free. So here's the deal. It has been so hard for us to figure out at Emergent how to communicate this risk loss scenario through some of the stuff that we've developed, not turning into a vendor pitch, that we had the hardest time. So we built a card game to try to explain it. And this has gotten off even better than the product. I don't think I should say that. So here we've got my friend Joel's son. He was the guy that helped build this card game and then playing it out. Earlier version, it kind of took on roll the dice, and they were doing impact elements. And this is, I think it was RSA last year when I ran after Mitnick and said, hey, I want to play a card game with you. And he said, okay, fine. And I asked him, does it look like this could actually, could you see this happening? He goes, yeah, I could see these scenarios happening. I have yet to find a scenario that we've put together that we can't in some way say, yeah, I could see how that could happen. So the permutations is about 4,000 different scenarios here. So the point of it being, this can be used in complex scenario conversations, or you could play it with your kids. And the range in between, your executives are more usually on the kid side, isn't it? So to teach you a little bit about this is where I'm going to need some help getting things out. Here we go. Give a different color to each one of our, here, let me actually set something up for you. My deck is a mess here. Pull two more cards out. There we go. Okay, so everybody gets a different color. One of you is going to be a bad actor. One of you is going to be, and so you don't need your decks right now because we'll be opening them up, and it's kind of hard to get the shrink wrap off. One of you is going to be a vulnerability. And these vulnerabilities are people, process, technology vulnerabilities, not just technology vulnerabilities. And one of you are going to be the targets. So go ahead and hand them all of them. But that works. So come on over and let's line up in this order: actors, vulnerabilities, and targets, so people can see you. And if you put them in order, then we can always add the rest of it, because that'll play with the rest of it as well. So we're going to build a scenario first. And I didn't catch anybody's name. What's your name?
Stephanie.
And Stephanie, which bad actor did you pick first?
Remote user.
Remote users. Yep. So, and your name?
Mike.
And Mike, which bad actor did you, you're at vulnerabilities. Which vulnerability are you picking?
Human error, because that never happens.
So you've got a remote user screwing things up. That never happens. And then what are they going after? What's your name, sir?
Christine?
And so Christine, what's the target?
Customer records.
Yeah, okay, so we've got a remote user screwing things up, making an accident, and going after customer records. Can anyone have a hard time believing that would ever happen? All right. This audience is great. So here's the next piece of it. Sunil, I'll let you do this one, actually. Come on up and join. Pick any one of those three.
Confidentiality.
Confidentiality. Okay, so now we're going to expose those customer records that we're going after. It's a confidentiality scenario. That's the usual world of cybersecurity right there. So we've got our remote users. Human error. Using human error.
Customer records.
So I'm after customer records.
Confidentiality.
Exploit the confidentiality. So here's the part that gets neat. Now, I'm going to take, here's a little bit of gaming it to make sure that the risk components are only confidentiality. So Sunil, now let's make this a business impact. Picked any one of those. Which one did you get?
Strategic.
Okay, so this is now a strategic issue because we're going to be exposing those customer records. And this is the point where we can start actually talking dollar cost quantification. looking at the customer records that you have, the size of the exposure of those, and the type of records that your remote users have access to, and the ones that they could possibly expose by screwing it up, is how you start getting to the elements of magnitude. And this is what we call digital risk. So it's more than just cybersecurity, it's the business risk impact, it's the digital risk, in this case it being strategic. Then a key piece of this is if you start thinking about those key risk indicators that we have. Those key risk indicators provide the simple question of, should I be nervous about this? So completely unrehearsed, Stephanie, Christine, Mike. So Stephanie, could you think of what type of metrics or things would you measure in your environment to see if you should be nervous about a remote user?
I would look at probably the metrics as one, when are they accessing, trying to look for patterns as to what's their usual pattern versus their something out of sequence, which would tell me that possibly their credentials been compromised.
I love it. I love it. That user training as well. Exactly. Access time, access records, monitoring. So you kind of know where I'm going with this. So Mike, what key risk indicators might you look for human errors?
I mean, just failed accesses and people jumping between, I guess, accounting versus marketing, etc., where humans that should be doing things that really they shouldn't be doing.
Have you ever worked with a coworker that sometimes they just don't seem to get it?
Yes.
So it's elements of what could we look at for log files. We have a pattern of what usual activity looks like, and then there are those coworkers that you're just not quite putting all of it together as what typical performance. So you're someone that might actually screw up, or that's someone that might screw up you regularly, right? Human error. And so lastly, you're at customer records. What kind of key risk indicators would you look at to see if you should be nervous about your customer records?
Like the data that it contains.
Does it have
Like,
PII?
yeah, credit card info,
Yeah.
social security numbers,
Yeah.
date of birth, home addresses.
Yeah. I like it. Yes. Okay. Excellent. And we don't really have metrics that we tie in for confidentiality, right? But the idea here is now that you can start putting data to capture elements of impact within each one of those. One of the things that we've built, and I'm happy to send this out, and we're wanting to open source this, and maybe it makes sense to share it with one of the working groups, is we built an ontology of about 900 different objects, trying to get down into specifics of customer records with EPHI or with PII and all those different elements, and use that to identify and populate the data. We can only have about 50 or so in a deck as opposed to the 900 that are captured as part of there. Now here's the cool part. Where are all those cards that you had, Sunil? The others. Oh, you guys have them. You're in your hands. So go ahead and pick any other card from your deck. Stephanie.
Desktop administrator.
Okay, so it's a desktop administrator. Keeping this, and so we're now a desktop administrator with it. Well, go ahead and say it.
Inadequate training.
Inadequate training. Stephanie, what do you have? Christine.
Mobile application.
Okay, so we have a desktop administrator with inadequate training, adminning your mobile applications. What's the bad thing that's going to happen?
Availability.
I screwed it up. Can't get to it anymore. So if you keep going through all this, there's multiple scenarios that at the point you say, yeah, I've had that one happen to me. And you can trade those out, all different elements, and build those out. And this is how easy it is to start building those scenarios, having this conversation. If anything, for your executives, it starts opening their eyes up to seeing all the different problems you're dealing with on a daily basis and how to get out of that. And then a key piece of this is once you start building some of those different loss scenarios with those different cards, you'll find some make a lot more sense to you than others, particularly if you've built in those key risk indicators. You get stronger links between those cards, and this was what my PhD was on. So you get those stronger links, and doing a link node analysis, you start finding the scenarios that you should be the most worried about. And those are the ones that you can start using for your tabletop assessments and building in your budget justifications. So that's the end of my talk. I want to say thank you guys. A round of applause for our volunteers. Stephanie, Mike, Christine. Oh, I have a question.
So these cards have like what is this, a hexagon, and it says impact with
Yeah.
a numerical score.
Yeah.
So how'd you come up with this number?
Guessing. So two things. I don't know if your deck. This is an old deck I have. I don't know if your deck has them or not, because those are like straight off the press. But in those anyway, we were trying to build an impact score, and it was just saying from your gut, how much do you think a mobile application, which is an impact of 2, versus corporate email with an impact of 1, how much would that hurt us in a generalized scenario? And then you just add them up, and you can start saying, oh, which scenario is worse than the other? So that's the link node analysis right here, trying to do it with a card deck. And that's the sort of thing that data would populate into. Yes. We haven't yet. We don't have smart screens on the cards yet to make them dynamically change based on the relationships, but exactly. If we go back one more slide, a link between here and here versus here and here could be completely different. Plus, if these two are not next to each other, if it's one here and slide this one down here, the relative location could also change. So the permutations start to explode as you put all of it together. This is kind of why we had to build a card deck to have a conversation about it in the first place. Good question. So I love that idea. Absolutely. So the 3 things we covered: change your position, changing your mindset, changing the conversation. And I see hands up, so questions. I'll run around with the mic.
On link node analysis, you can skew weights for different things. Have you done anything to skew based on industry? Certain industries are more tolerant to risk in certain areas.
Say if you take critical infrastructure for power systems versus healthcare, PHI, EPHI is going to matter more on healthcare, and on power systems, not quite as much. Brilliant question. And this is where one of the many challenges we have in our usual tabletop assessments is they're all generalized. When your boss looks at the front page of the Wall Street Journal and says, I don't want that breach to happen to me, you go, well, it could happen to us, but there's 10 other things that make me even more concerned. That's it customizing to your organization and to your industry. And that's dealing with the impact specifically within each one of those. So we've built some of that within the ontology. What it's come out to be more is there are some things that would only happen, like an ICS breach, or an ICS vulnerabilities, and ICS as a target that comes out in that way. So that's how we've addressed it. So great question. I'll just repeat the questions, I guess, is easiest. So, Mike.
Yeah, so your budget, and a lot of these, you're performing these risk assessments to understand where to prioritize, that sort of basically where your money should be allocated and your biggest risks. But in your experience, by doing this actually takes resources as well from
Yes.
a risk perspective. So is there a best practice ratio as far as how much resources should be allocated towards assessing risk versus implementing mitigations?
So the question is, how much of my budget should go towards risk assessment versus risk mitigation, right? So 100% should go to risk assessment, right? Yeah. No, I actually haven't seen that, but I think that those numbers. But one of the numbers that I have seen in the past that I like to go back to is comparing your security budget to your IT budget. Falling 5 to 7% is like a around the park number. So if your security budget is 3% of your IT budget, you want to take a second look. And it's only when you start talking government that it starts getting up north of 10, 15% is kind of elements of what I've seen, and I love anecdotes as to otherwise. That being said, the 3 lines of defense is such a new model that's come out that how much you spend on that second line, I haven't seen a lot of numbers as to how big the second line budget is versus the first line. But I know people in this room that know it, and I'd love to know what you know. Any other questions? Let's pop over here.
One of the useful things to this scenario is that it's if it's a card game, it's not you actually saying it. In other words, you're not putting a bullseye on your back. One of the biggest issues I have, and I'm in the second line, is when you go into a scenario and you need to let them know that an initial assumption was false. So where you had bad actors as your scenario, it would be nice to be able to have one called controls maker checker isn't actually there. In other words, you thought that you had A, B, and C, but you don't. Because as soon as you say that, at a senior level, you're challenging, and this goes back to the speaker yesterday who talked about a conservative versus a liberal approach. You're saying, we don't have what you thought we had. And therefore, you're challenging what they've been doing. And often, you know, you'll sort of say, wow, this sure sounds like willful blindness, or I've been told you can't say that in that room. So it makes a nice way to bring up those things as tabletop exercises.
So you bring up an important point that I want to highlight, which is part of what you said. Where are the controls? You know, we have this conversation about the risk, but maybe we made some wrong assumptions when we were doing risk, and there was a control in place we thought was effective, and it wasn't. Right, we've all dealt with control efficacy. We've all had vendors that show up, and sometimes they just forget to plug it in. It's not configured right. The tool just doesn't do what it was promised to do, and all of a sudden, our risk function isn't operating the way that we thought it was. The value of having a 3 lines of defense is your job. One of your jobs at that second line is to make sure that the first line has the right procedures and policies in place to check for control efficacy. And then you're doing a double check to say, does that really make sense? Because likely you came through traditional security route as well. Business, strategy, consulting, operations, technology. You're not just thrown into this brand new, but you've come up through a bit of an operations route. So you can call bullshit if it's not in there, right? And so looking at that first line is a way to go and check to say, are we really looking at our control efficacy the right way to capture it, to try to remove any of those false assumptions? But at the same time, those fall onto the risk managers at the first line, the hands on the keyboard. So, and your job is to make sure the right controls are in place to check for it.
Ryan Breed, one of the most difficult conversations I've had with C-levels has been on nonlinear impact and infrequent events. And, you know, the traditional risk management mindset is, you know, risk is probability times impact. And you have very low frequency events or unpredictable effects from what are assumed to be low-level impacts, but are actually, you know, nonlinear with respect to what's been done. And this is especially true in safety-critical environments, but happens to be true everywhere in the enterprise. People who take, you know, CVSS, yes, when you're over there, or when the secondary effects of what is assumed to be a very low impact event are actually much worse than anybody could have predicted. And having that discussion with somebody who's just thinking, you know, probability times impact, and oh, this is just a CVSS 7 or, you know, whatever. Having that discussion to really pull on those threads, what have you found works?
So yeah, what works, which I love as a conversation. Side note, we're going to be doing a podcast on what works in a little bit later, but so just watch for that one. So highlighting, you've got a CVSS 7. And how big of a deal is this? That's a first line conversation. And if you're having that conversation with your first line CISOs, with your SOC, with your operations team, and trying to extract out business impact second line capabilities, you're talking apples and oranges. There needs to be a translation between the two. Does not in any way mean that they don't know what they're doing at the first line, that they're not smart, that they are fantastic world expert threat hunting technical whizzes at that first line. But as humans, we can only be so good at such a narrow thing individually, and that's why we have to have a team to build on the rest of that. And so as a domain, this second line has been evolving just in the past few years to try to start to answer that question. Now, no way did we come up with this. This is Doug Hubbard. Loss exceedance curves is actually, loss exceedance curves have been in the insurance industry for a long time. One of the things that we're trying to do is introduce this into a risk management around cybersecurity conversation. A rare event occurrence that you're talking to, and to be able to statistically predict rare event occurrence is challenging because you have to have some element of historical piece of it and then a model to map it along that curve. And we're in the middle of finding out that a number of weather events are not lining up to expected curves right now. So we then have to reset and change our model events. But the black swan event that you're referring to is something that occurs all the way out here with a very low likelihood of occurrence, so it's a low acceptability rate and a very high impact. If this is a dollars, oh wait, other way around. This is a percentage, and this is dollars, right? But the fact is that it's asymptotic, and that yours always has to be an accounting for that. And when something breaks your model, or if based off of the things that should make you nervous in your enterprise brings this event up past this curve, you're now exceeding your risk appetite. And that's where you start to have this conversation. Even if the likelihood changes by a small amount, that's your job as the second line to start ringing the alarm bell before the incident has happened. And that's one of the main things that we're pushing with this whole second line approach. I should say that the industry is pushing with this second line approach, and one of the pieces that we're trying to get to. As a side note, at the other side, these are the bad things that you expect to have happen. You should have the insurance to cover it. You should have the budget to cover it. And when the boss comes and says, why'd you let that happen? Said, hey, that's part of the cost of doing business. Get off my case. I'm worried about the stuff over here. Next question. Let me give to other people that haven't talked yet, so it's hard for me to get back there. So, Stephanie, you want to shout or?
So, you know, the three lines fence, like you said, has come from the finance, and I frankly grew up in the finance side first, and now I'm in the security side. So I think, you know, we work with a lot of different customers, and what we're seeing is the gap between the CISO with the first line is they're still not able to tie to the strategic goals of the company and articulate the fact that these security risks will stop them from, and if they occur, will stop them tying to the the strategic goals. The second piece, yeah, and so the key is in that second line of defense, what we're also seeing is that originally the finance group and the security group had a large gap. They didn't look at, you know, risks the same way. The thing that's closing it is this whole Privacy Act. And the Privacy Act is data protection, whether it's strategic or PII data. And that's where we're seeing the business truly merge and the risk managers, because they've been doing risk assessments. So I think the security teams have to figure out how to marry up with these finance and risk teams to truly articulate and get to that point.
That is a great comment. I mean, even if your organization's not affected by GDPR, there's a lot of conversation around it. I mean, look what happened to us. Even when, you know, let's rewind almost 20 years to PCI. And once we can start tying dollars and business impact that's not part of a cybersecurity incident but is just compliance, all of a sudden we can start to join onto that compliance bandwagon. And if you are operating any globally, then you do know already the elements of GDPR and the rest of it. So instead of waiting for the bad incident to happen, and what we're talking about is predicting that, it's a matter of marrying up to something where there's compliance requirements or there's fines that you can put black and white in front of management to drive some of that conversation. When the auditors get involved. The auditors, that's that third line. Yep. Two more questions. Rich, come back. Awesome. Thank you. Last word. Anyone who hasn't talked, otherwise I will bring it right back to you. Anyone who hasn't had a chance to talk yet? Thinking about it? Okay, please.
Just an observation. It's not the black swan that you need to worry about when you're talking to other humans. It's that middle range. The black swan is, oh, we're too big to fail, or, oh, we'll all be dead. It's that middle range. You're out of your job. Your career that's a career killing loss as opposed to a firm killing loss. That'll get people's attention.
Surprising how big. Let's pick on Equifax. No one here from Equifax, right? It's always dangerous. Or any of your other favorite large breaches where you're like, wow, this is going to tank you guys. And then you find out, no, companies are resilient and investors will always want to go and pick up the pieces and keep it moving. The company itself won't die. But you are out, career ending and whatever stigma goes along with that. Exactly. So the key elements, Wall Street Journal, executives, they're always worried about the black swan. This is just day-to-day operation management. Are we appropriately dealing with the things that are likely to happen, you know, above the 50%. I love the slide that was words, one of the talks yesterday, words, meaning, percentage, likelihood. So some of those elements. I'll put my slides up on the conversation and a link if anyone wants to buy the cards. And I'm around all day, so if you want to talk more, please stop by. Thank you.